Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I'm Bryna and I'm president of the AMS, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this AMS Josiah Willard Gibbs lecture. These lectures were established in 1923 to show the public some of the aspects of mathematics and its application. They are named in honor of Gibbs, a mathematical physicist who made deep theoretical contributions in physics, chemistry, and mathematics, something all of us do, right? Yeah. Gibbs is one of the founders of statistical mechanics. He coined the term, and of vector calculus. His influence was so profound that he had even been featured on a US stamp in 2005. The list of previous Gibbs lecturers is a veritable who's who in broad mathematics, including G.H. Hardy, John von Neumann, and Albert Einstein. So today it's my pleasure to add another one to this list and introduce Yann LeCun for the Josiah Gibbs lecture. Yann is the Jacob T. Schwartz Professor of Computer Science, Data Science, Neural Science, and Electrical and Computer Engineering, competing with Gibbs in terms of fields, at the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences at New York, and he is the Chief AI Scientist at Meta. He is well known for his work in numerous areas, especially in computer vision and deep learning, and he's one of the developers of things you may be using all the time, the DJVU format that probably somewhere on your computer. He's won numerous awards. I won't list them all because then there would be no time for his lecture, but I will just note that he won the Turing Award recently in 2018. And he's a member of numerous academies, including the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the French Academy of Sciences. Without further ado, let me introduce Yann.
All right, now that Bryna has listed all the prominent speakers of the Gibbs lecture, I'm intimidated. And I don't believe I'll kind of fill the shoes of those names. But let me talk about AI, obviously. Everybody is talking about AI, and particularly about obstacles towards human-level AI. So a lot of people in the AI research and development community are perceiving the idea that perhaps we have a shot within the next decade or so of building machines that have a blueprint that might eventually reach kind of human-level intelligence. The estimates about how long it's going to take vary by huge amounts. The most optimistic people say we're already there. Some people who are raising lots of funds are claiming it's going to happen next year, but I don't believe so myself. But I think we have a good shot. And so I'm going to tell you where I think research in AI should go and what are the obstacles. And some of them are really mathematical obstacles. Okay, so why would we need to build AI systems with human-level intelligence? And it's because, in the near future, we're all going to be walking around with AI assistants helping us in our daily lives that we're going to be able to interact with through various smart devices, including smart glasses and things like that, through voice and through various other ways of interacting with them. So we'll have smart glasses with cameras and displays in them, etc. Currently, you can have smart glasses without displays, but soon the displays will exist. Right now they exist, they're just too expensive to be commercialized. This is the Orion demonstration built by our colleagues at Meta. So the future is coming, and the vision is that all of us will be basically walking around with AI assistants all our lives. It's like all of us will be kind of like a high-level CEO or politician or something running around with a staff of smart virtual people working for us. That's kind of the possible picture. But the problem is we don't know how to build this yet. And really, the current state of machine learning is that it sucks. I mean, in terms of learning abilities compared to humans and animals, it's really very inefficient in terms of the number of samples or trials that machines have to go through before they can reach a particular level of performance. So in the past, the dominant paradigm of machine learning was supervised learning, right? So supervised learning is you give an input to the system, you wait for it to produce the output, then you tell it what output you wanted, and if the output you wanted is different from the one that the system produces, the system adjusts its internal parameters to get the output closer to the one you want, okay? It's just learning an input-output function. Reinforcement learning, you don't tell the system what the correct answer is, you just tell it whether it's good or bad, whether the answer it produced was good or bad. And the main issue with this is that it requires the system to basically produce multiple outputs and ask you, is this good, is this bad, is this better? And that's even less efficient. So it only works for games, basically, or for things that you can simulate really quickly on a computer. So one thing that has revolutionized AI in the last few years is called self-supervised learning. And it works really great. It's really revolutionized AI, but it's still very limited. So self-supervised learning is the basis of large language models and chatbots and things like this, and I'm going to tell you in a minute how it works. But really, animals and humans can learn new tasks extremely quickly, and they can understand how the world works, they can reason and plan, they have common sense, and the behavior is really driven by objective. It's not just kind of predicting the next word in a text. Okay, so how does those chatbots and LLMs work? And I only have 2 slides on it, and then I'm not going to talk about it at all. Okay, so autoregressive large language models. They're trained to predict the next word in a sequence or the next symbol in a sequence of symbols. Okay, they can be words, they can be DNA, music, protein, whatever, discrete symbols. Okay, so you take a sequence of symbols, you feed it to a large neural net, and the architecture of the neural net is such that the system is trained to basically just reproduce its input on its output. This is called an autoencoder. Okay, so you just take the input and then tell the system, I just want you to reproduce your input on your output. But the architecture of the system is such that to produce one particular variable, the system can only look at the variables that are to the left of it in the sequence. It cannot look at the variable that it needs to predict. Okay? So basically what you're training it to do by doing this, you're training it to predict the next symbol in a sequence. Okay? But you do this in parallel over a large sequence. So you measure some sort of divergence between the input sequence you feed it and the output sequence it produces, and you minimize that divergence measure through basically gradient-based optimization with respect to all the parameters inside of the predictor function, which is some gigantic neural net which may have tens or hundreds of billions of parameters. Okay, this is really high dimension. Okay, once you've trained that system, when you take a sequence and you run it through it, the system is going to predict the next symbol. Okay, so let's say the window over which it looks at symbols here is 3. In reality, in an LLM, it can be several 100,000, but let's say 3. So you feed 3 words to that system and it produces the next word. Now, of course, it cannot predict exactly the next word, so what it produces is a probability distribution over all the possible words in a dictionary. And typically, in an LLM, we don't actually train it to produce word, we train it to produce tokens, which are like subword units, and a typical number of possible tokens would be on the order of 100,000. Okay, so now when you use the system, you feed it a sequence of words called a prompt. You have the system predict the next word, and then you take that and you shift it into the input. So now you can ask the system, what is the second next word? Have it produce it, shift it into the input, produce a third word, shift it into the input. So that's basically autoregressive prediction, a very old concept, obviously, in signal processing and statistics. And it works really well. It works amazingly well. If you make those neural nets really large. You train them with very large input windows on tens of trillions of tokens, data sets that have tens of trillions of tokens, sequences with tens of trillions of tokens. It works amazingly well. Those systems seem to discover a lot of an underlying structure about language or about whatever sequence of symbols you're training it on. But there's a major issue with autoregressive prediction. And mathematicians in the room here would probably do a much better job than me at kind of writing proofs about this. But autoregressive prediction is kind of a divergent process, right? If you imagine that you have those symbols are discrete, so every time you produce a symbol, you have multiple choices, maybe 100,000 choices, and you can think of the sequence of all possible tokens as some gigantic tree with a branching factor of 100,000. Okay, within this gigantic tree, there's a small subtree that corresponds to all answers that could be qualified as correct. Okay, all continuations that you would think are qualified as correct. So if the prompt is a question, the answer would be the produced text would contain the answer. Now that subtree is a tiny subset of the gigantic tree of possible sequence of the symbols. And the problem is, if you assume, which of course is false, that there is some sort of probability of error every time you produce a symbol, and you assume those errors are independent, and that probability is E, then the probability that the sequence of n symbols would be correct is 1 minus e to the power n. Even if e is really small, this has got to diverge exponentially. And it's not fixable within the context of autoregressive prediction. So my prediction is that autoregressive LLMs are doomed. A few years from now, nobody in their right mind will use them. Okay? And that's why, you've heard about LLM elucidation and things like that. Sometimes they produce nonsense. And it's essentially because of this autoregressive prediction. So the question is, what should we replace this by? And are there other types of limitation? Now, so I think we're missing something really big in terms of like a new concept of how to build AI systems. We're never going to get to human-level AI by just training large language models on bigger data sets. It's just not going to happen. And I'll give you another reason why in a minute. But never mind humans. Never mind, trying to reproduce mathematicians or scientists. We can't even reproduce what a cat can do. A cat has an amazing understanding of the physical world. And when I say cat, it could be a rat. And we have no idea how to get an AI system to work as well as a cat in terms of understanding the physical world. House cats can plan really complex actions. They have causal models of the world. They know what the consequences of their actions will be. And humans are amazing. A 10-year-old can clear up the dinner table and fill up the dishwasher without actually learning the task. You ask the 10-year-old to do it, and the 10-year-old will do it the first time. It's called zero-shot learning. Because the 10-year-old has a good mental model of the world and sort of knows, how objects behave when you manipulate them and how they're supposed to behave. A 17-year-old can learn to drive a car in 20 hours of practice. And autonomous driving companies have hundreds of thousands of training data of people driving cars around. We still don't have self-driving cars, at least not level 5 self-driving cars, unless we cheat like Waymo, which is fine. So we have AI systems that can pass the bar exam, they can do math problems, they can prove theorems. But where is my level 5 self-driving car? Where is my domestic robot? We still can't build systems that deal with the real world. The physical world, turns out, is much more complicated than language. And that's called the Moravec paradox, right? There is this idea that tasks that are complicated for humans, like computing an integral, solving a differential equation, playing chess or Go, planning a path through a bunch of cities. Those are kind of hard tasks for humans. It turns out computers are much better than us at this. They're so much better than us at playing chess and Go that really humanity sucks. And what that tells you is that when people refer to human intelligence as general intelligence, that's complete nonsense. We do not have general intelligence at all. We're extremely specialized. Okay, so we're not going to get to human-level AI by just training on text. And there is an interesting calculation you can make. So a typical LLM, a modern one, is trained on something like 2 10 to the 13 tokens, 20 trillion. And each token is about 3 bytes, so that would be 6 10 to the 13 bytes. Let's round this up to 10 to the 14 bytes, okay? That would take a few 100,000 years for any of us to read through this. That basically constitutes the entirety of all the text available on the internet publicly. So, I mean, that seems like an incredible amount of training data. But now take a human child. A 4-year-old has been awake a total of 16,000 hours, which, by the way, corresponds to 30 minutes of YouTube uploads. Not that much data. We have 2 million optic nerve fibers, 1 million per eye going to the visual cortex. Each optic nerve fibers carries about 1 byte per second, roughly. Maybe a little less, but who cares? So do the calculation, and that's about 10 to the 14 bytes in 4 years. There's just enormously more information in the physical world, in sensory information that we get from vision and touch and audition, than there is in all the text ever produced by all humans. So again, we're never going to get to human-level AI unless we can get systems to learn how the world works by observing the world. There's just way more information there than there is in text. And psychologists have studied this. You know, babies kind of learning various things about the real world, mostly by observation in the first few months, because babies really can't act in the world, you know, beyond their own limbs in the first 3 or 4 months. And so they learn a huge amount of background knowledge about the world, mostly just by observation. And it's a form of self-supervised learning that I think we absolutely have to reproduce if we want AI systems to reach animal level or human level intelligence. So babies learn notions like object permanence, the fact that if an object is hidden behind another one, it still exists, like stability, like you know, natural object categories without knowing the name of it, of them. And then things like intuitive physics, gravity, inertia, conservation of momentum, you know, this kind of stuff. Babies learn this around the age of 9 months. So if you show a scenario to a 6-month-old of an object that appears to float in the air, like the little scenario at the bottom left, 6-month-old babies won't be particularly surprised. But a 10-month-old baby will look at it with big eyes like the little girl here and be really surprised because by then they've learned that objects that are not supported are supposed to fall. Okay? And that just happened by observation, a little bit by interaction at that age. Okay, so to get to human-level AI, we're going to need, and we don't call this AGI at Meta, because again, human intelligence is not general. So we call this AMI, Advanced Machine Intelligence. We pronounce it AMI, which means friend in French. And so we need systems that learn world models, mental models of the world from observation, from sensory input, so they can learn intuitive physics and common sense and things like that. Systems that have persistent memory, systems that can plan complex action sequences, systems that can reason, and systems that are controllable and safe by design, not by fine-tuning like current AI systems. And the only way I can think of building a system like this is to completely change the type of inference that is performed by those systems. So the current type of inference that LLMs do, or neural nets of various types, is that you put an input, you run through a fixed number of layers in the neural net, and you produce an output, okay? An LLM does this. For every token, there's a fixed amount of computation spent to produce each token. So the trick to get an LLM to spend more time thinking about something is to trick it into producing more tokens. That's called chain of thoughts. And this is heralded as a huge progress in AI over the last few years. So it's very limiting. The type of functions you can compute by running signals through a fixed number of layers in a neural net. Let's say a neural net of reasonable size is limited, right? Because most tasks that you want to solve require many steps of computation. You cannot reduce them to just a few steps. Many computational tasks are intrinsically serial, sequential, not parallel. So you may have to spend more time thinking about more complex functions than answering simple questions. So the better way of performing inference would be inference by optimization. So basically, you have an observation, you run it maybe through a few layers of a neural net, and then you have a cost function, which itself is a neural net that produces a scalar output, and what it's going to measure is the degree of compatibility or incompatibility between the input and a hypothesized output. Okay, so now the inference problem becomes one of optimization, searching for an output that minimizes its objective function. I call this objective-driven AI, but really it's not a new concept at all. Like most probabilistic inference systems perform inference using optimization. I know there's quite a few people in the room who have worked on optimal control, so planning and optimal control. Motion model predictive control, for example, produces output through optimization. I'll come back to that. Okay, so this idea is really not new, but we've forgotten about it. And I think we have to go back to it. We have to build systems whose architecture is such that they can perform inference by optimization. The output is not an output, it's a latent variable that you optimize with respect to. And this is really classical in traditional AI, if you want. The idea that you search for a solution among a space of possible solutions. That's very traditional. It's just kind of forgotten. The type of tasks that can be solved this way would be somewhat equivalent to what psychologists call system 2. So in human behavior, there's two types of producing an action. One is called system 1. This is the kind of task that you do kind of subconsciously. You can take the action without even thinking about it. And then system 2 is when you have to devote your entire conscious mind, if you want, to the task and then plan, think about it for a while and then plan a sequence of actions. Like if you are building something, for example, and you're not used to that task, you will use system 2. When you're proving a theorem, you're certainly using system 2. So what is the best way to sort of formally represent what this process of inference by optimization is? And it corresponds to basically this idea of energy-based models. So an energy-based model is a model that computes a scalar number that measures the degree of incompatibility between an input x and a candidate output y, and performs inference by minimizing this energy with respect to y. Okay, I'm going to call this energy function f. Why f, not E, like energy? Because it's f like free energy. Okay, we're getting closer to the Gibbs kind of thing here. So that's the inference process. Now, modeling a dependency between two variables through a scalar energy function of this type is much more general than just learning a function from x to y. And the reason is that there might be multiple y's that are compatible with x. For example, if the problem you're trying to solve here is translating from English to French, there's many ways to translate a particular English sentence into French that are all pretty good. So they should all have low energy, okay, to indicate that those two things are compatible for the translation task. But there's no like single output that is correct. So basically, I'm talking about implicit functions here, right? Represent a dependency between variables through an implicit function, not an explicit one. I mean, a very simple concept, surprisingly difficult to grasp for a certain type of computer scientist. Okay, so how can we use those energy-based models in the context of an intelligent system that might be able to plan actions Okay, and this is kind of a diagram, a block diagram perhaps, of the internal structure of this energy function, scalar energy function. So in this diagram, round shapes represent variables, either observed or latent. Modules that are like flat on one end and rounded at the other end represent deterministic functions. Let's say a neural net that produces a single output. Rectangles represent objective functions. Basically, scalar output, the output is implicit here, but scalar valued functions that takes a low value when the input is acceptable and larger values when it's not. So here you can have two type of objectives. One that measures to what extent the system accomplishes a task that you want it to accomplish, and another set of objectives that may be guardrails. So things that prevent the system from doing stupid things or dangerous things or self-destructive or dangerous for humans around. Okay, so observe the state of the world, run it through a perception module that produces a representation of the current state of the world. Now, of course, you don't have a complete perception of the state of the world, so you might want to combine this with the content of a memory that contains your idea of the rest of the state of the world that you might have in your memory. Combine those two things and feed them to a world model. And what the world model is supposed to do is predict the outcome of taking a particular sequence of actions. Okay, so the action sequence is in the yellow variable box. And the world model predicts a representation of the world that will result from taking this sequence of actions. Now feed this predicted representation to your objectives, and then since all those modules are differentiables, they're all neural nets, you can backpropagate gradients through the action sequence, and by gradient descent, or something of that type, gradient-based optimization, find an action sequence that minimizes the objectives. And that's just planning, okay? So that's a process by which a system would be able to perform inference through optimization, but it needs to have this kind of mental model of the world to be able to predict what the consequences of its actions are going to be. Now, this is a very classical view in optimal control, the idea that you have some sort of model of the world or the system you want to control, and you feed it a sequence of actions, and you can sort of predict, you have, I don't know, a rocket you want to shoot to the space station, and what you have is a dynamical model of the rocket, and you can hypothesize a sequence of controls, and then predict where the rocket is going to end up, and you can have a cost function that measures to what extent the rocket is near or far from the space station, and then by optimization, figure out a sequence of controls that will get the rocket to the space station, okay? Very classical. It's called model predictory control. It's used everywhere in optimal control robotics and has been used by rocket trajectory planning since the 60s. Now, of course, the world is not entirely deterministic, so your world model may require latent variables, which are variables that you don't know the value of. Nobody is telling you what values they take, and they could take a number of different values. Maybe they're drawn from a distribution, and they might produce multiple predictions. So planning under uncertainty with a world model that has latent variables that basically represent everything you don't know about the world, or that will allow you to predict, would be a good thing, but that's not a solved problem. And what we actually want to do is hierarchical planning. So all of us do this, animals can do this. No AI system today can learn how to do hierarchical planning. We can get them to do hierarchical planning by building everything by hand, but no system really knows how to do hierarchical planning. So let's say I'm sitting in my office at NYU, and I decide to go to Paris. I'm not going to be able to plan my entire trip from my office at NYU to Paris in terms of millisecond by millisecond muscle control, which is kind of the lowest level actions I can take, okay? I can't do it because, first of all, it's too long of a sequence. Second of all, I don't even have the information, right? I don't have full knowledge of, whether the traffic light is going to be red or green, so do I need to, plan to stop or cross the street? But at a high level, I can have a high-level prediction of my mental model that says, if I want to go to Paris, I need to go to the airport and catch a plane. Okay, now I have a sub-goal, going to the airport. How do I go to the airport? I'm in New York, so I can go down in the street and hail a taxi. How do I go down in the street? Well, I'm sitting at my desk, so I need to stand up and go to the elevator, push the button, and then walk out the building. How do I go to the elevator? I need to stand up from my chair, pick up my bag, open the door, walk to the elevator, avoiding all the obstacles on the way. Okay, and at some level, when you go down the hierarchy, you're going to get to a level where you're going to be able to plan your millisecond by millisecond muscle control because you have all the information in front of you, right? So standing up and opening the door, I can plan ahead of time. So this problem of learning world models, learning hierarchical world models, learning abstract representations of the world that allow us to make those predictions at long range or short range so that we can do planning. Nobody has any idea of how precisely how to do this, how to make this work. So if we assemble all of those pieces that I told you about, we end up with something called a cognitive architecture for AMI, consisting of a world model, various objective functions, an actor that is the system that optimizes the action to minimize the cost, a short-term memory, in the brain it's the hippocampus, a perception module, that's the entire back of the brain, a configurator, let's forget about this. I wrote a long paper about this 2.5 years ago, which I put on Open Review, it's not on Archive, where I explain where I think AI research should go if we want to kind of make progress in that direction. This was before the recent excitement about LLM, although LLMs were already around. But I never believed they were the answer to human-level AI. Okay, so how do we get systems to learn mental models of the world from sensory input like video? Can we use this idea of autoregressive prediction, similar to what I explained before that LLMs were using, to train a generative architecture to predict what's going to happen in a video, predict the next few frames in a video, for example? And the answer is no, it doesn't work. I've tried to work on this for 20 years, complete failure. It doesn't work. It works for discrete symbols, for predicting discrete symbols, because handling uncertainty in the prediction is simple. You produce a vector of probabilities, a bunch of numbers between 0 and 1 that sum to 1. And that's how you handle uncertainty. The problem now is, how do you predict a video frame in a high-dimensional continuous space where we don't know how to represent probability density functions in any kind of meaningful way in things like that? We can represent them as an energy function that we then normalize. Physicists have been doing this, okay? But it's intractable. Most of the time, for most forms of energy functions, if you take e to the minus the energy function and normalize it, the normalization constant is intractable. So this idea of using generative models for training a system to predict videos doesn't work. A lot of people are working on it at the moment, but what they are interested in is not learning world models, it's actually generating videos. If you want to generate videos, of course you should do this. Generating cute videos. But if you want your system to really understand the underlying physics of the world, that's a losing proposition. And the reason is, if you train a system to make a single prediction, okay, which is what generative models do, what you get are blurry predictions, essentially. Because the system can only predict the average of all the possible futures that may happen. So my solution to this is something called JEPA, that stands for Joint-embedding predictive architecture. And that's what it looks like. Okay, you may not immediately spot the difference with the generative architecture, so let me make that more obvious. On the left, generative architectures. The function that you're minimizing during training is basically a prediction error, right? So predict y, observe x, observe y during training, and just train a system to predict y. Okay, this is like supervised learning, except y is part of x if it's a sequence. Okay, so self-supervised. This works for discrete y, doesn't work for continuous high-dimensional y. On the right, you have the joint-embedding predictive architecture. So now both x and y are run through encoders. And what the encoders do is that they compute an abstract representation representation of both X and Y. Okay, the encoders might be different. And then you make the prediction, you perform the prediction in that representation space. Now, this is a much easier problem to solve in many ways because there are many details in the world that are completely unpredictable. And what a JEPA architecture will do is basically find an abstract representation of the world so that all the stuff that cannot be predicted is eliminated from that representation. Think of the encoder function as some sort of function with invariance so that the variability of the input y that correspond to things you just cannot predict are eliminated in the representation space, right? So for example, if my video is a video of this room and I point the camera at the left side, I turn slowly and I stop the camera here and I ask the system predict what's going to happen next in the video. It can certainly predict that there's going to be people sitting in seats, etc. It cannot possibly predict where everybody is sitting, what everybody looks like, what the texture of the ground is, or on the walls. Okay, there are many things that you just cannot predict. You just don't have the information. And so instead of spending a huge amount of resources attempting to predict things that you don't have enough information for, just eliminate it from the prediction process by learning representations where those details are eliminated. So there are technical difficulties with this. Okay, so the conclusion to this is if what I'm claiming is right, we're much better off using the JEPA architectures than generative architectures, we should abandon generative architectures altogether. Everybody is talking about Gen AI. And I'm telling people, abandon generative AI. That makes me super popular, I can tell you. Particularly among my colleagues who spend a huge amount of effort actually building Gen AI systems. In fact, their whole organization is called Gen AI. Okay, so I mean, there's different flavors of those things with latent variables, etc. But I'm not going to go into those details. But there is an issue, which is how you train those things. Okay, so basically, training a system like this to learn dependencies consists in learning an energy function in such a way that the energy function takes low values on your training samples. Okay, so at a point xy, where you have data, the energy should be low, but then the energy should be higher everywhere else. So imagine xy kind of lie on some manifold. You want the energy function to be, let's say, 0 on the manifold, and then to kind of gradually increase as you move away from the manifold. And the problem with this is that I only know of 2 ways of training systems like this. If this energy function is parameterized in such a way that it allows it to take a lot of different shapes, you can have an issue, which is that it can collapse. If you just make sure that the energy is low around the training samples and you don't do anything else, you might end up with an energy function that's completely flat. That's called a collapse. So there are 2 methods to prevent collapse. One is you generate contrastive samples, those blinking green points, and you push their energy up. Okay, so you figure out some loss function which, given a set of training samples and a set of contrastive samples are outside the data manifold, is going to push down the energy of the observed samples and push up the energy of the contrastive samples. Okay, those are called contrastive methods. And the problem with them is that they don't work very well in high dimension because the number of contrastive samples you need to generate grows exponentially with the dimension of the space. So there's an alternative that you could call regularized methods. And what those methods are based on is essentially coming up with some regularizer function that, if you minimize it, will minimize the volume of space that can take low energy, that has low energy. That sounds a bit mysterious of how you do this, but in fact there is a lot of things that have done this in the context of applied mathematics, for example, in sparse coding. That's exactly what sparse coding does. When you sparsify a latent variable, you basically minimize the volume of space that can take low energy, reconstruction energy. Okay, so those 2 methods, contrastive methods and regularized methods. And there's different types of architectures that can collapse or not. Okay, this is the Gibbs lecture, so I have to mention Gibbs. this is how you turn an energy function into a probability distribution. You use the Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution. Okay, so take exponential minus the energy multiplied by some constant, which is akin to an inverse temperature, and then normalize by the integral of this over the entire domain. And what you get is a properly normalized probability distribution, conditional probability distribution of y given x. And if you really are insisting on doing probabilistic modeling, the way you should train your energy-based model is by basically minimizing the negative log of that conditional probability over your training set. The problem is that that's intractable because the partition function, the normalizing term, is generally completely intractable. So you would have to use approximations like variational approximations or Monte Carlo approximation. And I tell you, a good chunk of the machine learning community has been spending a lot of effort trying to do this, getting inspiration from physics and from statistics and various other things. I've made a chart. I don't expect you to read any of it here, but this is sort of various classical methods as to whether they are regularized or contrastive. Those methods, whether contrastive or regularized, have been extremely successful to basically pre-train a vision system to learn representations of images in a self-supervised manner. And the idea for this goes back to the early 90s, a paper of mine from 1993 and a couple more in the mid-2000s with some of my students at the time. There's more recent papers from Google, and a lot of people have been working on contrastive method. You may have heard of a model called CLIP, which is produced by OpenAI for learning visual features using text supervision. It's also a contrastive method. But again, it doesn't scale very well with the dimension. So I prefer regularized methods. And the question is, how do you make this work? One way to make this work is you have to prevent the system from collapsing, and a way to prevent the system from, so what does a collapse produce here? A collapse will consist in minimizing the prediction error, okay, d of sy tilde, and only doing that. And what the system can happily do is completely ignore x and y, produce constant sx and xy, and then your prediction problem is trivial. Your prediction error is 0 all the time, okay? But you have a collapsed model that doesn't do anything for you. So one way to prevent this from happening, and that's basically a regularization term, is attempting to maximize the information content coming out of the encoder, or the two encoders, okay? So have some estimate of information content, I of Sx and I of Sy, put a minus sign in front and minimize that. Now, that's a challenge because we don't know how to maximize information content. We know how to minimize it because we have upper bounds on information. We don't have lower bounds on information. And so what we're going to do is come up with some approximation, making some assumptions about information content, knowing that it's actually an upper bound on information content, and we're going to push it up and cross our fingers so that the actual information content actually follows. Okay? And it works. It's not well justified, but it's better justified than anything else that people have done. So it would be nice if you could come up with lower bounds on information content, but frankly, I don't think it's possible. Because there may be complicated dependencies that you don't know the nature of, and so it doesn't work. So the basic idea of how do you kind of put a number in a sort of differentiable objective function on information content, and the basic idea is make the representations coming out of your encoder fill the space. Okay, and that idea has been proposed by multiple people almost simultaneously in different contexts. And there are basically two ways to do this. So the contrastive methods should be called really sample contrastive, right? So take a matrix of vectors coming out of your encoder for a number of samples. Contrastive methods attempt to make the vectors coming out of the encoder all different. Okay? So imagine they're all on the surface of a sphere because you normalize them. You're basically pushing all those vectors away from each other so they fill up the space. It doesn't work too well. I mean, you need basically a lot of rows for this to work, to do something useful. If you have a small number of rows, then it's very easy to have random vectors, pointing orthogonal directions. So you need a lot of rows for this to work. So the converse is dimension contrastive methods. where you take the columns of that matrix and you try to make the columns different from each other, maybe orthogonal to each other. And that only works if you have a small number of rows relative to the dimension, because otherwise it's too easy. You have a small number of high-dimensional vectors that need to be orthogonal. I mean, take them randomly, they'll almost be orthogonal. Okay, so you have kind of a duality between those two things. In fact, we have a paper on the fact that those two things are dual of each other. But I prefer the second one because they can deal with high-dimensional representation space, whereas the first one really can't. So what we've come up with is something we call VICREG, that means variance, invariance, covariance, regularization. And basically the idea there is you take the SX representation and you have a cost function that insists that over a batch of samples, the variance of each variable is at least 1 using a hinge loss. And then a second cost that insists that the off-diagonal terms of the covariance matrix, so basically this matrix transpose multiplied by itself, that the off-diagonal term of the covariance matrix are as close to 0 as possible. So basically you're trying to decorrelate the individual variables, make the columns of that representation matrix orthogonal. And other people have had kind of similar ideas, Yima at Berkeley and some of my colleagues at NYU with a method called MMCR. And we have some theorems that prove that in certain conditions, when you apply this criterion to decorrelate, after going through some nonlinear function, what you're actually doing is making the variables pairwise independent, not just uncorrelated, which is interesting. But still, you know, this is all kind of a little wishy-washy. So a lot of challenges, I think, for astute mathematicians. Now, I'm going to skip this about latent variables because I don't have time. I'm just going to show you the last slide about this because, again, that has to do with Gibbs. The fact that if you want to minimize the information content of a variable, which you need to do if you have a latent variable, a good way to do this is to make it noisy. So instead of inferring a single value for this variable, you infer a distribution over this variable, and you maximize the entropy of that distribution. And the best way to do this is by writing down what's called a variational free energy and minimizing that. And you know, Gibbs had something to say about that. This I'm also going to skip for lack of time. You can actually use this VICREG technique and apply it to PDE. PDE, not solving, but like, for example, finding the coefficients of a particular PDE by just looking at windows on the solution. So basically, take the space-time solution of a PDE, take two windows and train a system to produce a representation of those two windows using this VICREG criterion by basically forcing the two representations to be identical regardless of the pair of windows. And the only thing that the system can extract, which is common between different windows in the solution of a PDE, are basically the coefficients of the PDE, a representation of the equation of the differential equation itself. And when you, I don't have time to explain, but when you apply this to various situations, it actually works. If you want more details about this, you might want to talk to Randall Balestriero, who is sitting somewhere here. Where are you, Randall? Right here, okay. He's one of the main authors of that paper, and he can give you some details. The bottom line is that when you use this VICREG stuff to learn the coefficients of a PDE, you actually get a better prediction than if you train it in supervised mode, which is kind of interesting. Okay, there's another set of methods, alternative to VICREG, called distillation-based methods. And we use them because they work well, but I don't like them because they're even less theoretically justified than the VICREG information maximization techniques. And I'm not going to go into the details of how they work, but you're minimizing a function that is not actually being minimized by gradient descent. It's a mess. There are some theoretical papers on this. I listed one at the bottom here, but only in the case of kind of linear encoders and predictors. And really, it's not such a satisfying method, but it works really well. And a lot of people have been using it for learning features of images in a self-supervised manner. There's a technique called IJEPA, which I won't have time to describe in detail, but it does a really good job at kind of learning representations of images that you can use then for a subsequent task that would be supervised, but without requiring too many labeled samples. And then there is a video version of this called Video JEPA. So you take a video, you mask a big chunk of it at all times, for example, and then you train some gigantic neural net, a JEPA architecture to predict the internal representation of the full video from the representation of the partially masked one. And what you get in the end is a system that does a really good job at representing videos. You can use that representation as input to a system that can classify the action taking place in the video and do things of that type. And I'm not going to bore you with tables of results, but it works really well. And one really interesting thing about this technique, this is a paper that we just finished and we're submitting. When you test those systems and you measure the prediction error they're doing on a video, if you show them a video that is physically impossible, like an object disappears or changes shape spontaneously, it tells you that can't happen. My prediction error goes through the roof. And so this system has kind of learned a very basic form of common sense, a little bit like the babies I was talking about earlier. And that's really a surprising result because the system is really not trained to predict, it's just to kind of fill in missing parts. And we've been using kind of self-supervised encoders and predictors to do planning. So I'm coming to this idea of world model. So let's say you have a picture of a state of the world, and the system can control a robot arm. And you want the system to basically act in such a way that the final state of the world looks like a particular target. So let's say you have a bunch of blue chips on the table and you want to kind of move a robot arm so that at the end the blue chips are all within a nice little square as represented here in the middle. And so train an encoder, so we use DynoV2, which is a pre-trained encoder, and then train a world model to predict what is going to happen at the representation level when you take a particular action. Can you predict the resulting effect on that board with blue chips? And then once you have that world model, which you can train from random data with random actions and random blue chips, can you use it to plan a sequence of actions so as to arrive at a particular result? And I'm going to cut to the chase. There's various problems that we have applied this to, and it works pretty well for planning several things. But here is the result for the blue chips. Okay, so what you see here is a video. You don't see the actions of the robot arm, but it's actually taking actions. And what you see at the top is what's happening in the world. And what you see at the bottom is what the system predicts is going to happen in its own internal world model. We trained a separate decoder to kind of produce an image of what the internal thinking of the system is. Let me play this again. So at the bottom here, you see kind of the configuration kind of progressing as the robot kind of pushes things around. And then the end state is not exactly a square, but it's pretty close. And this is a very complex dynamical system where the chips are interacting with each other. You could not, really kind of model this sufficiently accurately to kind of do planning with a hand-constructed model, really. With kind of similar work for planning and navigation in real world. I'm going to skip this because I'm running out of time. So my recommendations, abandon generative models in favor of the joint embedding architectures, abandon probabilistic models in favor of energy-based models, abandon contrastive methods in favor of regularized methods, abandon reinforcement learning, I've been saying this for a decade now, in favor of model predictive control and planning, and if you are interested in human-level AI, just don't work on LLMs. In fact, if you are a PhD student in AI, you should absolutely not work on LLM because you're putting yourself in competition with enormous teams with tens of thousands of GPUs at their disposals. You're not going to be able to contribute anything. Okay, problems to solve. Large-scale world models, how do you train them on multimodal inputs? planning algorithms. I think there's a lot of expertise perhaps in the room here in optimal control, in sort of various ways to perform optimization. When you use gradient-based method for planning, you get hit by all kinds of local minima issues and non-differentiability and all that kind of stuff. So maybe methods like ADMM would help. JPA with latent variables and planning with non-deterministic environment, regularizing latent variables, hierarchical planning, etc. And so, what are the mathematical foundations of energy-based learning? When we're stepping out of probabilistic learning, we're getting into the unknown, and characterizing what is appropriate to do there is not clear. Learning cost modules, I didn't talk about this, but that's also an issue. Planning with inaccurate world model and how you adjust the world models. Okay, so maybe if we solve all those problems within the next decade or half decade, we're going to be on a good path towards building systems that are truly intelligent, that are capable of planning and reasoning. And I think the only way for this to work is if the platforms are open source. I've been a big advocate of open source AI, and I really believe in this. But if we succeed, maybe AI will be sort of a big amplifier of human intelligence, so that can be only good. Thank you very much.